Good evening to all. My name is Georgios Anagnostopoulos, and I'm presently the director of the UCSD Center for the Humanities. On behalf of the Center, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this special event. Professor Wilson's career is a living proof of the saying that small is big. Starting from his seminal studies on the ants, one of the smallest organisms visible to the naked eye, Wilson went on to develop some of the biggest theories about human social behavior and its basis in the interplay between biological makeup and environment. Theories about human nature and about our relation to the rest of the living world. Wilson sees in his favorite organisms patterns of nature that are to be encountered across all living things. More recently, Wilson has sought to lay out more clearly the presuppositions of his earlier work that straddles a variety of disciplines by examining the interconnections among different approaches to inquiry, especially those between the humanities and the sciences, and defending the unity of knowledge across all disciplines. While universal acceptance of Wilson's views may not have been realized yet, universal recognition of his achievements has. He has won many prestigious awards from around the world. It is my distinct privilege and honor to present to you Professor Edward O. Wilson, who will speak on the coming synergism between science and the humanities.
Professor Anagnostopoulos, members of the UCSD faculty, students, visitors, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, among whom I can count quite a few here. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to address, especially in this setting, what has to be regarded as one of the fundamental and still largely unanswered intellectual questions, namely, what is the epistemological relation of science to that of to the humanity? How do the two visions of truth relate to one another? Can that question be answered? I think so. Both of these great branches of learning, science and the humanities, and with them the intermediate domain of the social sciences, are allied in their effort to understand the human condition and our species' place in the cosmos. Somehow, I hope we can all agree it's worth trying to translate knowledge and insight gained from each one in turn and into the other by some common language. Those who speak from science and those who speak from the humanities respectively usually talk past each other because the goal of scientific research on one side and the goal of the creative arts, which form a large part of the core of the concerns of the humanities, on the other side, understandably different. As a result, they always seem to diverge outward from one another in discourse, in style and purpose. Consider this, for example. Scientific results are by necessity couched in specialized language. They're trimmed for brevity and delivered to the audience raw. Metaphor is unwelcome in science, except in small homeopathic doses. Precision and replicability are essential. Hyperbole, no matter how brilliant, spells death to a scientific reputation. Understatement and modesty, even false modesty, are preferred because in science, discovery counts for everything and personal style next to nothing. In the arts, and let me focus immediately on literature since science and literature share verbal expression, metaphor and personal style are in polar contrast to science, everything. The creative writer, unlike the scientist, seeks channels of cognition and emotional expression, already deeply carved by instinct and culture. The most successful innovator in literature is an honest illusionist. His product, as Picasso said of visual art, is the lie that helps us to see the truth. Imagery, phrasing, and analogy in pure literature are not crafted to report empirical facts. They are instead the vehicles by which the writer transfers his own feelings directly or attempts to into the minds of his readers in order to evoke the same emotional response. The central role of pure literature is the transmission of the details of human experience by artifice that directs aesthetic response. Originality and power of metaphor, not new facts and theory, are the principal coin of the realm in creative writing. Their source is an intuitive understanding of human nature as opposed to an accurate knowledge of the material world, at least in the literal quantifiable form required for science. Metaphor in the best writing strikes the mind in an idiosyncratic manner. Its effect ripples out in a hypertext of culture-based reasoning. Yet it triggers emotions that transcend culture, that seem to be true of humanity's basic nature. Technical scientific reporting, on the other hand, tries to achieve exactly the opposite. It narrows meaning and avoids metaphor. It tries to preserve literalness and repeatability. It saves emotional response for another day and another venue. Yet, the creative processes of science and the humanities are closely similar. The best scientists approach their work with the same emotions and wild surmise of the imagination. The ideal scientist first thinks like a poet, then works like a bookkeeper, and finally writes like a journalist. In approaching the human condition, as opposed to, say, supernovae and Hox genes and alien moles, the scientist is closely similar to that of the poet, of other creative artists, and of the scholar in the humanities. I would like to suggest that the following is the central question relating science to humanities. It's this: can the products of science and the humanities, insofar as they touch on the human condition at least, be made consilient? Can they be bridged by modes of inquiry that permit translation of a generally accepted level that is also heuristic, that it promotes further inquiry and deeper understanding? Tonight I want to address that possibility, primarily from the side of science, because of course that my training and bias are there, but with the understanding that the exchange that we're referring to has to be reciprocal. This conjunction is not an easy task. It's not the way knowledge has been organized and the way we usually think. And let me put the matter then this way. Since the 18th century, the great branches of learning have been classified into the natural sciences, the humanities, and the social sciences. Today, we have a choice. On the one hand, between trying to make the great branches of learning consilient, that is, coherent and interconnected by cause and effect explanation, and on the other hand, not trying to make them consilient. Surely universal consilience is worth a serious try. Surely it would be highly productive, the effort alone. After all, the brain and mind and culture are composed of material entities and processes ultimately. And they do not exist in an astral plane that floats above and outside the tangible world. Consilience, defined then as cause and effect explanation across the disciplines, has plenty of credibility. It's the mother's milk of the natural sciences. Its material understanding of how the world works and its technological spin-off are the visible foundation of modern civilization. The time has come, I think, to consider more seriously its relevance to the social sciences and the humanities. I grant immediately that belief in the possibility of consilience beyond the natural sciences and across to the other great branches of learning is not the same as science, at least not yet. It's a metaphysical worldview, and a minority one still at that. And now let me get the first slide. I believe that the attempt also has practical urgency. The effort to consider the unity of knowledge has practical urgency. Think of two intersecting lines forming a cross, as indicated here. Label out of any number of topics that one could pick, but I thought it was relevant to use environment. Label one quadrant environmental policy, the next ethics, the next biology, and the final one social science. Each one of these subjects, as you know, has its own experts, its own university department, its own language, rules of evidence, and criteria of validation. And each is an island of knowledge in a huge sea of ignorance. Now, if we focus on more specific topics within each of these quadrants, we see how general theory, epistemological theory, we can call it, translates into the analysis of practical problems. And we understand that in each case, we somehow have to learn to travel, how to travel in a clockwise fashion suggested here from one subject to the next. In a single discussion, maybe in a sentence or two in the discussion, it's necessary to travel the entire circuit. And that's the way the human mind works, and that's the way the real world is. Thus, we could start with forest management, all the issues, the complex issues of forest management. And very quickly, we're into the realm of moral reasoning, the political part of regulation and market planning in forest management is quickly translated into ethics, because all politics is ethical, or pretends to be. So where does the ethics come from? How will we develop an environmental ethic? Well, one thing we need is a knowledge of the environment. We need a detailed knowledge of the environment. You know, what are the problems? What's happening? What are all of the results and options that would work out? And then we have to refer back further to economics and exactly what would be the impact and the plus and the minus of particular procedures and market planning and deforestation or preservation of reserves and so on. And in order to do that, we also have to understand human nature, about which more later, and then on back around. And as we travel, it's just ordinary thinking and discussion. As we travel around circles like this, now look at the concentric circles. And real life is where most real world problems exist is at the center, or near the center. So as we approach the intersection where these real world problems exist, the circuit becomes more difficult and the process more disorienting and contentious. The nub of the problem vexing a great deal of human thought is the general belief that a fault line exists between the natural sciences on one side and the humanities and the humanistic social sciences on the other side. In other words, very roughly between the scientific and literary cultures as defined by C.P. Snow in his famous 1959 Reed lecture. The solution to the problem, I believe, is a recognition that this boundary is not a fault line. It is not a permanent epistemological division. It's not a Hadrian's Wall, as many would have it, needed to protect high culture from the reductionist barbarians of science. What we are beginning to at last understand is that this line does not exist as a line at all. It is instead a broad domain of poorly understood material phenomena awaiting cooperative exploration from both sides of what we perceive to be this line. And here are key disciplines of the natural sciences you will know, that are beginning to build bridges across that largely unexplored domain. And you will note they are all biological. During the past 20 years, these four borderland disciplines have grown dramatically in the natural sciences, or more precisely in the biological sciences. And it is their exponential growth that has made it more apparent that we can bridge these great branches of learning, in my opinion. Thus, we have the cognitive neuroscience, sometimes called brain sciences, power by technology that has allowed brain scanning, reading of areas of the brain, and even broad patterns of circuits in the brain during many kinds of thought, including now increasingly subjective thought, emotional response tied in with rational thought, even of fairly complex kinds. And in behavioral genetics, we are at the edge now, having mastered genomics and the human genome, and are proceeding with gene mapping, and a whole host of extremely well-funded, and they deservedly so, molecular biologists have begun to journey across the great proteomic sea with working out activation schedules and the enormously complex interrelation of 100,000 or more proteins that go into making up a cell, and so on. Now we have the prospect of seeing the biological sciences move right on to the lower levels of organization in the central nervous system and the sensory system, and to understand that from the ground up, bottom up. Then evolutionary biology, sociobiology, and its offspring, evolutionary psychology, is with increasing evidence and persuasiveness tracking some of the changes that have likely occurred in the origin of fundamental social patterns, behavioral patterns in human beings, about which more in just a moment. And then what might seem less likely connected, environmental science is growing by great leaps and bounds. And this is quite relevant because, among other things, environmental science tells us a lot about the world as it was when human beings first came along. The cradle in which the human species, a biological species in a biological world, was born, and the ways are changing it is affecting not just the environment and the rest of life, but our own behavior, our own potential, our own psychological health, even in eliminating the environment which we originated. All of this has been going on, as I said, exponentially. And here we see an already out-of-date curve for DNA, which is now mostly mapped, almost completely mapped, and then the rapidly rising curve for the gene map, with the genes composed of the base pair sequences that were elucidated by the recent astonishing advance toward the complete genome mapping of base pair mapping of the human genome. And from the social science side and from the humanities side, the bridging disciplines include cognitive psychology, biological anthropology, and increasing engagement of political science, even a new field of borning called various names, including bioaesthetics, about which more later. And these connections are strengthening quite rapidly. And why is this conjunction among the great branches of learning important? Because it offers the prospect, in addition to allowing us to see how these subjects relate, of characterizing human nature with greater objectivity and precision. It's an exactitude that is the key to human self-understanding. The intuitive grasp of human nature has been always the substance of the creative arts. It's been the underpinning of the social sciences, and it's been, as yet unmet, a beckoning mystery to the natural sciences. To grasp human nature objectively would be and explore it to its depth scientifically, and to grasp its ramifications would be to approach, if not attain, the grail of scholarship and to fulfill the dreams of the Enlightenment. Now, rather than let the matter hang in the air rhetorically and somewhat grandiosely, I want to suggest a preliminary definition of human nature and then to illustrate it with examples from existing literature and of ongoing studies. Human nature, this is the definition, is not the genome. That prescribes it. It is not the cultural human universals like the incest taboos or rites of passage. Those are the products of human nature. Rather, human nature is the epigenetic rules. There are various terms that you could use as well: developmental algorithms, genetic algorithms, and so on. But let's call them epigenetic rules. Epigenesis, patterns of behavior following upon the activation of the genetic code in the development of body and then of mind and behavior. Epigenetic rules, the inherited regularities, in this case, of mental development. These rules are the genetic biases in the way our senses perceive the world, the symbolic coding by which we represent the world, the options we open to ourselves, and the responses we find easiest and most rewarding to make. In ways that are beginning to come into focus at the physiological and, in a few cases, even the genetic level, the epigenetic rules variously alter the way we see and linguistically classify color. They cause us to evaluate the aesthetics of artistic design according to elementary and distinctive rules by which we judge abstract shapes and the degree of complexity. They lead us differentially to acquire fears and phobias concerning the dangers in the environment, as from snakes and heights, running water, wolves, close space. Incidentally, that program sensitivity and an easy acquisition of aversion and phobias is mostly limited to the ancient perils of humankind. The ones that really kill us now, we haven't had time to evolve innate aversion and phobias. Cars, knives, automobiles, knives, electric sockets, and so on. If we evolved naturally, in a few tens of thousands of years, they would be included. But they came along too early and to be Darwinian, to be programmed by Darwinian means. To communicate with specific patterns of body language and facial expression, to bond with infants, to bond conjugally, and so on across a wide range of categories of behavior and thought are among the product of these epigenetic rules. Most of the rules are evidently very ancient, dating back millions of years in mammalian ancestry, and others, like the stages of linguistic development, are uniquely human and probably only hundreds of thousands of years old. Now let me spell out several of the examples of what I'm referring to. When you raise or lower the intensity of light in a room, say with a dimmer switch, we perceive that as the continuum it actually is. Our perception of light back in the visual cortex is reading it as a continuum. It's coded for us to see it that way. But if we take monochrome light, starting, say, at the short blue end, and then we gradually increase the wavelength so that we run through the rainbow colors, but one color at a time, monochrome color at a time. We don't see that as a continuum, but rather we pass through 4 areas, the basic colors, in which relatively small change is recorded or perceived in the color, in the visual cortex. And there are intermediate areas in which the change is quite rapid and difficult to handle in terms of perception and classification and so on. And we know the basis of that. I won't dwell on it too long, but this is one of the experiments indicated here by which this has been worked out fairly nicely. That's a Munsell array. It's a standard color array. You go top to bottom and differing in intensity, but mainly you go through the visual part of the electromagnetic spectrum from one end to the other. And as you do, you as I see this as a series of distinct colors, and the basic colors become quite evident as you scan back and forth. And we know the basis of this. We know it neurobiologically. We know pretty exactly how the color cones of the retina contain pigments that are sensitive to a particular wavelength and thus receive and encode and feed back through interneurons to the optic nerve, and the wavelength, the code that a certain wavelength is coming in, and on through the thalamus to the lateral geniculate nuclei of the thalamus, on back to the visual cortex, where a great deal of information is then compacted into an area called the V8 region of the lower visual cortex. We know all that stuff, and we know the molecular biology. And I say, thanks to the molecular geneticists and biochemists, we know the genes that control the development of that capacity through the color cone chemistry, and we know what changes occur pretty exactly in the DNA that causes the various colorblind mutants, and so on. Now, when native language speakers are shown the Munsell array you just saw, and they're asked to put the color terms in their language, just point to them on the Munsell array. What you get, and this is convergent among speakers of some 20 languages that have been tested this way, is a clustering of those terms in the least ambiguous areas, on the basic colors. Now, they vary from within each, there are changes within each parts of the color spectrum, and there are different color terms in the most advanced color vocabularies to designate that. But generally speaking, you get that clustering, and they stay away from the intermediate zone. And we know from other experiments that when people are given color vocabularies to learn, then they, and new color vocabularies with neologisms, new terms, and asked to build their own color vocabulary, they stay away from those ambiguous and quick changing intermediate zones. So here we have a simple, maybe not too convincing because it's not elaborate enough, example of going from genetic evolution, genes, to culture. But there's something much more interesting involved in this. And that is the evolution of color vocabulary. Anthropologists have put together color vocabularies from cultures all around the world. And when you see what the sequence is in going from very simple color vocabularies, as you get, say, for example, in some New Guinea highlanders, to cultures with the most elaborate color vocabulary. And let me say that involves 11 basic color terms. You know, the basic colors are the variants within the basic colors and so on. 11 colors that are semantically interchangeable among the vocabularies of different cultures, so that you can take a color term from one culture and map it onto the color pretty persuasively in the use of it and so on, of another, or one on two colors together, or two onto one, and so on. That's what mapping is, and there are 11 of these colors. And it has been found that as we go down from two colors, when there are only two colors, two terms in the color vocabulary, it's black and white. You go to a culture that has three, generally it's black, white, and red. If you go to four, black, white, red, green, or yellow, five, black, white, or dark, light, red, green, and yellow, and so on. In other words, we have evolved, evidently, in a particular direction. If you have 11 colors, there are 2,036 different ways to evolve from 2 to 11, 2,036. Human beings have evolved along just 22 of these ways. Interesting. But we don't yet know. See, this is the kind of challenge. That is from ethnography. That is from one of the humanities. We have this information, but the biologists, to the best of my knowledge, have not yet begun to look into the neurological basis of this type of building of complex language, or the genetic language. So as a second example now of epigenetic rules, consider the instinct to avoid incest. The key element is the Westermarck effect, and that's after the Finnish anthropologist who discovered it a century ago. When two people live in close domestic proximity, they use the same potty, so to speak. During the first 30 months in the life of either one of them, both are desensitized, unconsciously desensitized, to later close sexual attraction and bonding. They may engage, brother and sister, shall we say, with sexual experimentation or exploration, but not, it doesn't matter whether they're related or not. I mean, as long as they live in that close proximity and be totally unrelated, they are desensitized. And they do not mate, as a rule, voluntarily or have children. The Westermarck effect has been very well documented in anthropological studies, although, once again, the biologists have not yet gotten to a genetic prescription or the neurological mechanics of it. Again, an example of the humanities producing an interesting and testable general result, which now is a challenge to the natural sciences to take it down levels of explanation more deeply. And the biologists know, and this is what genetics has contributed, that if you have mating, and most of you would be familiar with this, within 2 degrees of kinship, that is as far as out as a first cousin, you run a risk of bringing together 2 or more deleterious genes that would be ordinarily present only in one dose. If it were present in more than one dose in your body, you'd be dead, or you'd be, you'd be disabled or unable to reproduce. So if you're closely related to people, to a person, and you mate with them, brother, sister, mother, son, so on, in what we call incest, then the results are deadly in terms of the effects on offspring statistically. Each species of organism that reproduces sexually has its own incest-avoiding mechanism built into it, an epigenetic rule probably in most cases. And this is the human one. And what makes the human evidence the more convincing is that all of the non-human primates, that's our closest genetic relatives, monkeys, apes, whose sexual behavior has been closely studied, also display this Western mark effect. So what we have, the human species have, is a fairly ancient hereditary rule for avoiding instinct that goes back well beyond Homo sapiens. In another wholly different realm, consider the basis of aesthetic judgment. Now I'll move from biology back in the direction of the humanities. Neurobiological monitoring. Neurological monitoring, in particular measurements of the damping of the alpha waves during presentation of abstract designs, have shown that the brain is most aroused by patterns in which there is a 20% redundancy of elements, or put very roughly, the amount of complexity found in a simple maze, or two turns of a logarithmic spiral, or an asymmetric cross. Thus, in these three randomly generated designs generated by computers, of the three, the one that most arouses you, whether you realize it or not, is the one in the middle. It may be a coincidence that about the same property, same amount of complexity and design is shared by a great deal of the art in friezes, grill works, colophons, and flag designs. It crops up again in the glyphs of ancient Egypt and Mesoamerica, as well as in the pictographs of modern Asian language. Take, for example, one out of huge numbers of examples we picked almost at random. This is the title page of an issue of the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And the artist was asked to present an abstract image representing the brain. And there you are, about that level of redundancy. And then the colophon of Daedalus, that journal is down there, in the same range. Japanese print. Each character holds to about that. And what is the significance of this for culture? And how can it be elaborated in cultural evolution? Here is the Raisho style of Japanese calligraphy. This is from the 17th century, and it illustrates calligraphy as an art form, one of the great Asian art forms. And in this case, the artist individually is expressing, with a flourishing start and finish of each stroke, a stern and commanding appearance in these ideograms. It gives the impression of strength, and it was used, for example, for plaques, back covers, and the like. One can imagine how responses of this kind of tendency to create cultural products then could involve a combination of tendencies and epigenetic rules involving emotional response common to us all, requiring no great detailed training of children to respond. The Wayo style of Japanese calligraphy, very different, and used in different contexts, delicate, elaborate, and graceful, but the same traits. And who can deny the intrinsic beauty, the aesthetics beauty, the power of the Punjabi written language? Again, it's about the same level. And then going to what we call primitive art, frequently, I hope the examples I have picked have not really spoiled the case, but this is so common, so general, that I think that there is something to be said about this as at least stimulating further thought and investigation. These are Surinamese paddle designs from the Juka and Saramaka people of Suriname. Now, none of this is proof. And indeed, the neurobiology of it, the arousal curves and so on, need a lot more verification than they've received. But the universal nature and preponderance of the effect has to be considered very suggestive. And let me make a bold suggestion, if my suggestions haven't been bold enough for you already, that the theory of the arts, a genuine theory of the arts, I mean consilient, going down levels of causation, awaits its Mendeleev, that is, its equivalent of the genius who first put together the periodic table of the chemical elements. Because I think we're talking in a very broad metaphorical way here of a Mendeleev-like table in the formation of much of our cultural artifacts and cultural choice. To take the same approach, but in another direction, I'd like then to mention biophilia, the innate affiliation people seek with other organisms, especially with the natural world. Studies have shown that given complete freedom to choose the settings of their homes or offices, people gravitate toward an environment that combines three features, all of which brilliantly illustrated by the UCSD campus. But I have chosen here the headquarters of the Deere Company of Moline, Illinois. Made it as mundane otherwise as possible. But this is something that it's a notion that I've discussed. It's not original with me, but I've documented and for purposes like this. And I have presented an address to the National Association of Landscape Architects and got nothing but approval back. I mean, well, we knew all of this. What's new about this? Well, let me say that psychological studies, choice studies, have shown that given complete freedom to choose the setting of their homes or offices, people gravitate toward an environment that combines three features, intuitively understood by not just landscape architects, by real estate entrepreneurs. And they are. People want to be on a height looking down. They prefer open savanna-like terrain with scattered trees and copses. They want to be near a body of water, such as a river, a lake, or ocean front, even if all these elements are purely aesthetic and not functional. They will pay enormous prices to have this view. They look for two other, we're still at the Deere Company headquarters. They look for two other cross-cutting elements. They want a retreat in which to live with something behind their back, protection, retreat. And the prospect of fruitful terrain in which to forage. And in the prospect, if I'm not pushing this too hard, they like distant, scattered large animals or sculptures thereof, and they like trees with low, nearly horizontal branches. And even studies have shown even they prefer pinnate leaves. The Japanese maple is considered by many the ultimate in this nature of this kind as an ornamental. In short, if you'll allow me now to take a deep breath and then plunge where you may not wish to follow, people want to be in the environments in which our species evolved over millions of years. That is, hidden in a copse or against a rock wall, looking out over savanna and transitional woodland at acacias and similar dominant trees of the African environment. And why not? Is that such a strange idea? Let me tell you that all mobile animals, down to the very simplest with tiny brains, have what we call habitat selection, innate habitat selection. They have elaborate algorithms of searching for the right microenvironment and the right spot to settle and hunt or live and nest. This is a universal trait. And why then would it be such a strange thing to find at least a residue of humanity's long, long evolutionary history when we have good evidence that it was this kind of an environment in which we evolved? And then, again, there is the biologically important realm of erotic aesthetics, the basis of sexual attraction. I found many years of lecturing at Harvard that about 2/3 or 3/4 the way through a lecture, it was a time to bring up something that had to do with sex. And I was always delighted to watch how heads came up. Copies of the Harvard Crimson were surreptitiously eased to the floor, and pencils were picked up, or pens were picked up again. So let me now admit, perhaps place this where I might have the same effect on you. It is the matter experimentally being investigated of preferred female facial beauty, open to objective analysis, and also, lest I be accused of sexism, similar work going on male attractiveness. The ideal preferred is not the exact average. It's put together by computer, averaging out frontal facial views of a large sample of young, in this case, Caucasian women. It is the one on the right. Wait a minute, hold on. The ideal, it's not at the one on the left. I'm losing my sensitivity. Okay, it's not the one on the left is the computer-aided averaging out of a large sample of young women without bias. The one in the center, which is the average of the subset considered the most attractive, and then blended by the computer. And the one on the right is just a continuation of trajectory going from left to center until finally the preferred is reached. The ideal has higher cheekbones than the average, a smaller chin, shorter upper lip, and wide eyes, all relative to the size of the face. Now, the evolutionary biologist, if pressed, might surmise that these traits are the signs of juvenescence on the faces of young women, hence relative youth and reproductive potential. And if all this seems irrational to you, ask any middle-aged professor whose second wife is a graduate student. How much do we know about the innate basis of such aesthetics? Not a lot, and certainly very little about the genetics and neurobiology, in particular the epigenetic rules. Not because they've been investigated and then found lacking, not because they're technically daunting, but simply because they have not been studied. The right questions have not been asked. The right research procedures have not been designed. Only recently have researchers begun then to ask the right questions within these borderland disciplines that I alluded to earlier. Bear with me while I just move a bit farther into the subject with a bit more speculation. In the arts, I believe we convey emotion with what students of animal behavior call releasers. That is, very simple stimuli or configurations of stimuli that evoke complex, mostly hardwired responses. And just in passing, I want to show you Cézanne and Picasso with painting essentially the same setting, picture. And in the top, we see Cézanne, preponderance of curving strokes conveying a sense of relative calm versus angular strokes to evoke tension and violence. Is this response to these elements part of the hereditary epigenetic rules? I would expect that to be the case. Artists have returned to them faithfully for centuries. My point is that genetic evolution and cultural evolution are closely interwoven, and they're only beginning to obtain a glimmer of the nature of this process. We know that cultural evolution is shaped substantially by biology. That biological evolution of the brain, especially the neural cortex, has occurred in a social context, so they are interlocked in some manner. But the principles and details of this gene-culture coevolution are largely unknown, and they are a great challenge in the emerging borderland disciplines to which I referred. In my opinion, gene-culture coevolution, represented here as a cartoon and as a cycle, is the central problem of the social sciences and much of the humanities in a pure intellectual sense. And it's one of the great remaining problems of the natural sciences. Solving it is the obvious means by which the branches of learning can be foundationally united. Let me acknowledge that critics have said, and they will continue to say, that whether this conception is correct or not, the program, they say, is impossible. The two major gaps that traverse in the borderland between the natural sciences on one side, they say, and the social sciences and humanities on the other, genes to brain, and then from brain to culture, are just too wide and complex to master. There is, furthermore, in this view, emergent properties that can never be reduced in the manner of the sciences. Perhaps, the critics continues, they even reflect fundamentally different epistemologies, and we just haven't grasped that fact sufficiently, at least on the science side. I have various responses to this radical anti-reductionism. They are relatively technical, and I think because of shortage of time, I'm going to pass over them. But I would mention, in doing so, that neuroscience is emerging, neurogenetics. And here, an example, for example, in the mapping of the speech memory area, part of the cognitive neuroscience advance that I mentioned earlier, is moving so rapidly as to make these objections less defensible with each passing year. And the complexity of complex behavior is being mapped in ways that are very illuminating with respect to basic human behavior. For example, this circuit from the basal ganglia to the thalamus to the frontal cortex, from automatic control area in the basal ganglia of repetitive behavior to the thalamus that distributes out information on all of this to other parts of the brain, to the prefrontal cortex, where consciousness, conscious thought and decision are made, helps to explain the possible genetic basis of much of the repetitive behavior that characterizes us and that has found its way into cultural universals, rituals, formulaic prayers, ceremonies that are repetitive, incantation, purification rites, and so on. And we do know now that if this is tipped too far, this circuit, if it's locked on too hard, then we get the psychiatric condition of OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. It then goes out of control or becomes destructive. When regulated, then it is a powerful automatic control system of the brain. To summarize then and to close, biologists, social scientists, and humanities scholars, by meeting within the borderland disciplines, as they have begun to do now, have begun to discover increasing numbers of epigenetic rules like the one I've illustrated and speculated on here. These epigenetic rules will rarely be obvious or intuitive to us by reflection and self-understanding, unaided self-understanding. Biology is a domain. The way the human body and the brain was put together is jerry-built. It had to be done by these elaborate coding methods from going from the gene up. It's rarely something that the brain itself can understand, and certainly not understand the evolutionary history, twisting evolutionary history to lead us to where we are now. Darwin correctly said that the citadel, the mind, and all that it implies to understand it, that citadel cannot be taken by frontal assault. It has to be taken by all of the means that we can throw to understand it, to conquer it and understand it from all of the great branches of learning. I'm very aware that the conception of biological foundation of complex social and cultural structures runs almost intrinsically against the grain for a lot of scholars. They object that too few such inherited regularities have yet been found to make the case solid. Well, they're right. And in any case, higher mental processes and cultural evolution are just too complicated and shifting and subtle to be encompassed this way. Reductionism is the sin of the natural scientist approaching the intermediate zone. Reduction, they say, rips human thought from its context. It is vivisectional. It bleeds away the artist's true intended meaning. It melts the Inca gold of the humanities. But the same was said by the vitalist about the nature of life when the first enzymes and other complex organic molecules were discovered. The same was declared about the physical basis of heredity, which was said to be beyond our reach until perhaps late in the 21st century, even as early evidence pointed straight to the relatively simple DNA molecule as the carrier of the genetic code. And most recently, the doubts about the accessibility of the physical basis of mind are fading away before the successes of sophisticated imaging techniques and others. In the history of the natural sciences, a common sequence is predictably unfolded as follows. An entry point to a complex system is found by analytic probing. At first, just one, and then more such paradigmatic reductions are accomplished, and syntheses following them. Examples are multiplied as the whole system opens up and the foundation architecture is laid bare. And finally, when the mystery is at least partly solved, the cause and effect explanations seem in retrospect to have been obvious and even inevitable. The value of the consilience program, if I may label it that is now beginning, a renewal of the Enlightenment agenda, if you wish, is that at long last we appear to have acquired the technical and the conceptual means either to establish the truth of the fundamental unity of life, of knowledge as dreamed by the Greeks originally, as brought to a brilliant early formulation in the Enlightenment. We are in a position either to establish the truth of that or to discard the idea, which would be an even more sensational advance, actually, if we came to decisively discard it, than to establish it. But I think we're going to establish it. The great branches of learning seem destined to meet in this way, and if it does, then it will be a historic event that happens only once. I hope I live long enough to see it thus occur. Thank you very much.